Hello and welcome to Conversations with an Almost Catholic. I am Kevin, non-Tradicath, and I am very honored today to be joined by Edward. What's up, Edward?
Hey, not much. I'm awake and ready to go. So let's
Cool.
talk.
I'm excited. So for the audience, Edward and I first started talking over Reddit DMs, and I think the your first message to me was something "Hey, glad I found your account. I was getting uh, close to converting to Catholicism, but your videos wound up making that not happen." Something like that. It's a very loose paraphrase of your message. But I'd be curious
Oh
to
yeah, we'll
hear.
get to the specifics. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Well, hey, I'd be really interested to hear more about that. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about who you are, only as much as you want to tell us. But I'm in particular interested to hear about, I guess, your faith background, and then how you wound up almost converting and why you didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was raised in a kind of non-denominational evangelical household. I would say that's probably the simplest way to put it. And this was a pretty devout thing, I would say. It wasn't just like a mere cultural Christianity. It was a pretty, every weekend going to church. My mother worked for the church for a period of time. And so I got all of that. All of the kind of culturally inculcated bits of Christianity were part of my life growing up. And you know how kids can kind of rebel a little bit against that, or at least question it in a what is initially, I would argue, a very healthy way. Um, and I remember being very intrigued by what other people believe because for a period of time it was simply not on my radar, right? And into my teen years, it's funny. I look back upon this is very kind of pre-internet, or I should say, at least pre smartphone days. But I remember how independent I felt as soon as I got a library card. and, and especially once I could drive, because I remember hiding books in my car, like just going to the library and just devouring anything that seemed interesting to me. And I basically stuck out and or hung out in the section of religion and spirituality at the library. And so I remember just consuming and looking at everything I could get my hands on. And, that coupled with, uh, because at this point, we're talking the 2010s, right? The internet is out of its pioneer days at this point, and you know, there's a lot online in terms of what people can discover and learn about the world's faiths and whatnot. So all of those things got me kind of questioning and exploring, if you will. And so I mentioned to you prior to this conversation about my notion of what I kind of called test driving a faith. And to be specific, what I mean by that is not necessarily believing all of the tenets of any given faith in earnest, per se, but acting from a position of what if this really were true? And so, from that point of view, I found that I've been able to get a much more inside look at some of these faiths from an experiential first person point of view, if you will, with the obvious downside to this being that I've been pulled in by the tractor beam, as I called it, of various faiths over the years to varying degrees, with it taking some weeks or maybe even months to realize that actually I'd been believing a number of things without any real evidence or good reason. And on one hand, without that kind of firsthand experience, I don't think I'd really feel comfortable passing judgment or saying that I'd really found the right home for me, per se. And also, to some extent, this may stem from a fear of missing out, right? A very human emotion. The idea that there would be a spiritual home that I never actually found because I settled for something else. Yeah. So early on in my life, there was a lot of this uh, looking at looking at different possibilities in terms of truth and what's going on in the world in terms of religious belief and whatnot. But it's really hard to do month after month of deep dives, if you will, into particular religious worldviews, unless you're convinced that it might be true on at least some level, right? So that was the angle at which I was approaching these things throughout my teen years into adulthood, one of openness rather than skepticism, for the sake of allowing myself a deeper immersion, let's say. And again, that immersion comes with the cost of very possibly being convinced by some of these ideas, at least temporarily. Uh, as what I was basically doing was entering and exiting different echo chambers and seeing which one seemed closer to my understanding of reality or truth. So I think it's often said it's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it, they say. And the only qualifier I'd add to that is that to truly entertain certain religious thoughts is, to a degree, to ride that line between staying at a comfortable distance and going in deeper towards what could feel like the beginning of a conversion experience. So that is probably the simplest way to put it, the most succinct summation of the experience in the abstract, applicable to all of the belief systems I've encountered in this way over the years, is that immersion in a worldview, a web of beliefs, followed by the eventual creeping feeling of there's no way this is how the cosmos actually works, right? And so Christianity was the last of these in a way, as I felt like I had explored most other major world religions over the years. And at that point, never really felt the need to revisit Christian thought. But the curveball I hadn't expected as a Protestant was all of the Catholic apologetics thrown at me thanks to YouTube. This began like all the others, okay, I'll bite. What's this about? And naturally, I went down this rabbit hole and read everything I could get my hands on for a few weeks and just devoured information about it on the premise of, what if being raised Protestant, I more or less started at the finish line and just did this whole prodigal son thing for a while here? What if Christianity was indeed true and I just had the wrong denomination or interpretation of it all? And, part of the reason why this worked was that while my rejection of other religious systems for this or that reason mostly happened as an adult, my disbelief in Christianity happened earlier than the others. It was kind of in my teenage years, just a result of watching some criticism online by this or that new atheist guy, a few episodes of the Atheist Experience, stuff like that. Some unacademic conspiracy theory documentary like the Zeitgeist one, the early YouTube stuff. Like, I don't think it got the same critical deconstruction, if you will, that I did of these other religious faiths that I looked at later on in my life, probably just due to the maturity of myself at the time. So anyway, sometimes you feel the need to like clear something from the table and then you can continue and go on with your life. And that's kind of how Catholicism was for me. It was just like this interesting thing. I can't honestly say that I was, because some of these earlier issues had never been resolved for me. One of them would be the problem of eternal hell and some other things that we'll get into later. But, those were still issues that I just couldn't really get around. So I can't act like I was ready to literally jump into the church per se, but like there was still this part of me that just couldn't help but continually research it and listen to opinions on it, And what shut all of that down very officially was watching a few of your videos and, why that showed up in my YouTube feed. I have no idea. The algorithm works in mysterious ways, as they say. But, at that point, it's like all it really required was getting one or two, kind of videos of opinions that were outside the echo chamber, outside the bubble, and then the whole thing just kind of pops on its own. Like, I felt a real need to truly understand Catholicism from the point of view of believing Catholics, and that required me watching and listening to a lot of different Catholic opinions, and it was just kind of interesting and fascinating. And I wanted to hear their arguments from their perspective. But yeah, because there's so much sleight of hand, if you will, if I can use such a disingenuous pejorative phrasing of Catholic apologetics, it's not like you're really necessarily getting the whole picture, and watching a few of your videos, particularly the ones that were just going over your thoughts on something like the tilma, right? Or some of these miracles and whatnot. Those are the things that make you realize, like, yeah, they're not being entirely honest here with all of the facts, and it just kind of took me back to reality, so to speak. So that's the gist of it all, from a kind of bird's eye view. I hope that starts us off all right.
No, I mean, it definitely does. Yeah, I guess one of my major critiques of Catholic apologetics as a whole, I think, is that I think that there is a huge fear, and Risto is saying that that was his experience with Catholic apologetics as well. Yeah, and let me say, so not totally honest is probably not. It's not a bad way to phrase it. I think, and I'm doing a little bit of like psychologizing here, which I know I shouldn't do, but I think
Mm,
I think that this stems from a desire to be a des- I think it comes from a desire not to scandalize people, you know? Like I think that Catholic apologetics, and this isn't only apologists, this is like priests and stuff too. Um
mm,
they might look into something like the tilma and they might be like, yeah, like this is not made out of cactus fiber, guys. Like this isn't like, this is amazing. But they might know that and they might see the devotion that it is inspiring in the congregation or in their YouTube audience or whoever we're talking about here. And
sure.
I think that they kind of just ignore it and don't talk about it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Um,
Or they have maybe they have, for example, for your listeners, we were both discussing music because we're both musicians before this call started. And, the Tillman, like the rather completely abstract way that they just mapped on musical notes to the ratios and dimensions of the tilma, the kind of thing like, we could do that five, six, seven different ways depending on, how you want to approach it musically. And it's just not the miraculous thing that you think it is. Like there may be a believing Catholic who knows that because they work within the music industry, for example, or they're going to say, well, that aspect of the tilma, clearly they just don't understand it, right? But oh, maybe it really does map onto the constellations or something like that. And then someone who's more learned in that area can't believe for the life of them that so-called miraculous claim, right? And so I think, you get piecemeal like that, the entire congregation believing the entirety, of something like that. And yeah, I absolutely, I think apologetics has this tendency. It is one of looking at, the kind of atheist argument from back in the day where it's like, we don't have all of the pieces of this puzzle, but we can tell that it's basically, it's the picture of a duck, right? We don't need every single puzzle piece. Yeah. And religious people like to use this argument as well. We would use it maybe in like a God of the gaps kind of sense of like, this is clearly where the evidence points. We don't need every single piece. Whereas, again, religious people will try and use that for the opposite argument. But I think that there's something to that for sure. And for me, looking at a lot of those miracles, actually working for the opposite direction rather than starting from like, does God exist or not? It was better to chip away at the external shell of something like Catholicism, like chronologically, like start with the most recent stuff, start with frankly, the incorruptibility of the saints is really weird, and covering people with wax, the Fatima stuff, the most recent kind of Marian apparitions, or some of that, and start from there. And if you start to doubt some of that, maybe you can slowly work your way towards the center of the earth here, rather than trying to start from the fundamental premise of something like God, which frankly you have to accept you're probably never going to get a satisfactory answer on to begin with.
Yeah, and I don't know about what it's like for somebody who wasn't Catholic looking at all this stuff, but for me, all of this external stuff kind of was what it was to be Catholic for me. Like
Mm,
the way that so I grew up attending a church called Our Lady of Fatima Chapel. Like Fatima was a huge deal in like my culture, you know? Um so like and, we talked about Padre Pio a lot. We would read Lives of the Saints way more often than we would read, you know, any text from the biblical canon. Um,
yeah.
and so for me, seeing this external stuff kind of get chipped away, um, that was like really damaging for me. But there's, I don't know if it's different kind of seeing it from an outsider's perspective.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, certainly I would say Protestants probably have a little bit more of a wall of defense up, if you will, because they don't have any recent apparitions, miracles per se that are like canon, right? There is the claim of individual miracles and things like that, but there's nothing that vulnerable and easily attacked within the immediate Protestant position in terms of what is like required of belief, let's say, or believed at large within a congregation. So um what you can really attack there from as far as Protestantism goes is you get attacks from other religious people like Catholics saying, come on, look at the Septuagint. Why don't you believe in the Deuterocanonical books? Or they get these things like that where they may have to defend their beliefs, but they don't have to say that Mary appeared on the top of this building in Egypt or something like that in the 1960s, or they don't have to believe those things, and so there's a little bit less there to attack in terms of recent events, let's say, within Protestantism. But I mean, you had a guy on recently named James, I believe, and he said that you could be born into Catholicism and critique it and judge it fairly as an adult. I kind of got to say yes and no to that. Personally, I think part of it is you can, if and only if you're really willing to look at media, books, info outside of that particular bubble, right? You can't say, well, I critique Catholicism all the time, but I only listen to Pints with Aquinas. That's not a really, I mean, that's disingenuous. It just is. You have to at least be willing to do that. And I understand how difficult that is. There was a period of time in my teenage years when I would listen to those like atheist debates, Christian debates on YouTube, and I would fast forward the Christian, right? And at previous times I felt myself doing it in the opposite direction. It's like, I don't want to hear what Matt Dillahunty has to say. Get to William Lane Craig, and that is such a human thing to do. And noticing that we're doing that and that we are now consciously blocking out parts of reality and putting our blinders on is a really important thing for anyone of any religious belief or disbelief to notice that they're doing, because what you're doing there is effectively reducing your information that you have to work with.
Yeah, so I remember the kind of the beginning of my questioning kind of did start with me fast forwarding the atheists in these debates.
Yep.
And I guess at some point I kind of decided, if I am really doing this thing, then I should do it right. I should try to step outside of that echo chamber. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
There's this, I don't mean to pick on him, but to go back to the same guy that you were talking to before, I mean, he also said, like, and I believe he said it in good faith, that, feel free to question and look at things fully, because when you find the truth will be holy and apostolic and Catholic and so on and so forth. And I think, like, that has not been my experience. But I think that by saying that to a lot of people, what it does is it projects confidence in one's belief. And I think that confidence is what other people pick up on, and they then don't actually question to the same degree. They just see, well, he's really confident, and that must mean, his conviction has some bedrock to it, some real foundation to it. And yeah, I think people have to do the research for themselves.
I never feel good saying this because it's like kind of not polite. Maybe it's even mean. But apologetics, I think that apologetics is more theater than scholarship, if that makes sense. I think that the reason why we have different words, right, for apologetics and for like scholarship is because they are different things. And it doesn't seem to me like people go to apologists for academic reasons. It seems to me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, people go to apologists because they want to see a.
They want to believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. They want confirmation of something they already believe, or they want to watch, the other guy get demolished, right? Um, I think within academia, that's probably not a hot take, right? I think they've felt that way for a long time, and yeah, there are different types of apologetics. Definitely, I would say on the whole, apologetics is closer to politics. It's closer to like watching a political debate. There is a bit of, because when you say the word theater, we have to understand that a lot of it is, as you find in politics as well. Um, and I have no interest in going into politics during this talk, but you find, from regardless of political affiliation, a lot of memorized statements, right? A lot of things that are, listen to William Lane Craig, or listen to any of these guys. Uh, you hear the same statements repeated a lot because these guys do the same thing a lot, right? And I think that is closer to something like what you see in political debate than it is in academia, right? Because they tend to be a lot more. Their feet are held to the fire of truth a bit more, and they have a society of other academics who are going to really critique them if they step out of line a little too far. And the same cannot be said of debate kind of setting, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, the sidebar is talking a lot about different kinds of apologetics. Risto's adding much of scholarship is apologetics, and I'll be interested, Edward, to get your take on this too. I think I agree or disagree with the idea that scholarship is apologetics based on what we mean by apologetics. So I can think of certain people who kind of straddle the line. I was trying to think of a Catholic example, but the first one that came to my mind was somebody like Mike Licona. He's a Protestant, but he's also a scholar.
Yeah.
And I think of Mike Licona more as a scholar than an apologist. Now, he is a scholar who signed a statement of faith and got kicked out of the institution that he taught at for supposedly violating his statement of faith.
Mm.
But he's still a devout Christian. And so I think that he's somebody who, if you referred to him as an apologist, I wouldn't be like, no, he's a scholar. And if you called him a scholar, I wouldn't be like, no, he's an apologist.
Well, yeah, I think people are aware that apologetics in the abstract can almost be a pejorative term when compared or juxtaposed to academia. And I don't mean in any larger sense that academia is being somehow infiltrated by apologetics, but there are a lot of people who've put their belief first and who have the PhD or have the research studies that they've done. But the whole point of why they've put out academic papers is because they want to use it to bolster apologetics. And so you do have to have kind of a discerning eye there for sure. There's people within academia who are primarily interested in convincing other people of their religious beliefs. And just because they're academics doesn't mean they necessarily can hide that.
That's true. Yeah. And I like what Midnight said here, that apologetics works backwards from the conclusion. And I'll agree. If we're using apologetics in the pejorative sense, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I don't think that
Yeah.
Mike Licona always, maybe sometimes Mike Licona works backwards from the conclusion, but not all the time. And I think I feel justified in saying that because he did get kicked out of the college that he taught at because he violated his statement of faith. And I think what did him in was that he admitted that there might be mistakes in the Gospels or something like that. Like he said, like, there might be legitimate contradictions.
Which is a pretty, like, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of even full-on religious believers would be comfortable with saying something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's just to use an example off the top of my head. I mean, there's, take the notion of genocide in the Bible, which is, you got the Alex O'Connors of the world and people like that who love to talk about it. And I think a lot of people saw him talk to William Lane Craig, right? You can you can have that kind of believer who says, no, I mean, if God commanded this, right, then this is his kind of personal theory, right? Then it's completely good and okay. And who are we to say otherwise? But then I think you have people outside of that who would say the Bible isn't perfect. The Bible is a record, over time of man's gradual understanding of God and the nature of God, culminating, of course, in the figure of Christ. And that is a very different way of approaching it. And, that's a kind of high Christology, if you will, a way of interpreting the Bible, everything through the lens of Jesus. That's something some people will do. And I think it's probably a better position morally, because it doesn't require us to believe things about genocide that, basically, if someone has a different religious belief, Sam Harris pointed this out years ago, that doesn't make you that much different from any suicide bomber, right? If you truly believe that this is divinely commanded of you. And so, yeah, not to go off on the tangent or something like that, but yeah, to admit that there may be a mistake in the Bible should not be in and of itself such a damning thing, I think, and especially for academics. For example, it's generally well acknowledged now that a lot of what we would call Judaism grew out of earlier Canaanite polytheism. Yeah, and of course, if you believe in a very literal interpretation of Genesis, you probably think there's something wrong with all of that scholarship. But that scholarship, is more respected, let's say, than Ken Ham.
Yeah. I actually grew up listening to Ken Ham on like cassette tape, which is so weird because I grew up Catholic. But the way that
Yeah, even I didn't do that.
okay, well, yeah. I mean, it's funny the way that I when I tell people how I grew up, I think a lot of people tell me that I grew up more Protestant than Catholic, which is probably fair. The sect that I grew up in was very, we were young Earth creationists and all that. So yeah, maybe I did grow up more Protestant than anything else, but to go back to your point about, how a lot of religious people do have no problem with, there being a contradiction between gospels. That was a huge deal for me. And that was part of the reason why, I think I ultimately wound up where I wound up now, is because like, I remember being shocked when I really started, like, I guess like 2 years ago or whatever, when I like really started digging into Catholic YouTube. Like I would say 6 years ago is when I really started digging into the scholarship, but I didn't really ever get super involved in YouTube until about 2 years ago. And then when I really started watching a lot of Catholic YouTube, that's when I realized that there was a lot of Catholics who just didn't care about, like, they were like, yeah, so what if there's contradictions between the gospels? To me, that was shocking. But it's not that shocking to a lot of people, which is good. I think that a lot of people probably remain Catholic because they have a little bit more of a resilient faith, than the faith that I had, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I found that shocking. When you were getting pulled in by the tractor beam, were you getting close at all to any kind of so what kind of Catholic tractor beam were you stuck in?
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because so there are certain things, for example, that I just think were really silly from a non-Catholic point of view, right? That were stopping me from any actual conversion, right? One of them is the kind of stubborn insistence that hell is eternal, right? And so there was that was an issue from the get-go, right? And as smart as he was, let's say, it always struck me as really funny that, Aquinas insisted that hell was literal, and that one of the parts of heaven, one of the experiences of heaven, the joys of heaven, was watching the people suffering in hell. Like, to me, that is such a dumb thing, right? That it made me think less of him, right? Like, in a really strong way. And it's harder to, go ahead and read the Summa or read some of these Catholic writings and think, okay, these people believe things I could literally just never believe. So some of those things were seriously stopping me from having a great interest in Catholicism. But you see Balthazar, you see Dare We Hope, you see these kind of glimmers of, okay, these are more reasonable voices. Maybe that kind of Catholic is more like the kind of Catholic I would be, right? And so you put the issue down for a while. But I never felt a strong love for something like the papacy, which led me to being interested in Eastern Orthodoxy as much as Catholicism. And just as a thought experiment, I did note to myself, because I'm here in Asia, And, for people who don't live in the United States, even for people who do live in the United States in certain parts of the country, if you think that Eastern Orthodoxy is the one true church, you know, you're kind of screwed if you live in a lot of places geographically, because there ain't no Orthodox church for you. And that's certainly true of just huge parts of the world. And it's less true of Catholicism. There's Catholic churches in a lot of countries when you compare it with Eastern Orthodoxy. So, when I was interested in just like saying, all right, well, just for the fun of it, just for the hell of it, or maybe the heaven of it, I'm going to go to some of these churches and just kind of just show up and see what it's like inside, and so I did that a few times just for curiosity's sake, and I never felt comfortable. I never
Really?
felt comfortable. Yeah. And that made me that interested me a lot. That I could feel interested and like just in some of these things in the abstract or online or when reading a book, I could feel comfortable with it. But as soon as I stepped into the church, I just felt like nah, it just didn't feel right. I remember going in one locally here, and there's like a giant, cardboard cutout of Pope Francis inside, and like
That's pretty
just
weird.
yeah. Welcome to Asia, I guess. Yeah. Yeah, he was the only other white guy in the room was the cardboard cutout of Pope Francis. But some of the times I went and there was no one else in there. Again, apart from paper Francis. Um, And still, I didn't quite feel comfortable. It just felt kind of weird to me. And I don't mean to suggest that there was anything more to that, but just that like internally, it highlighted the fact that no, this isn't me, like ultimately, I think it helped me come to that conclusion. And um, again, I had a lot of reservations. It wasn't per se like I was really quite on the cusp of converting or something, but it certainly was completely shut down. Again, as soon as I started viewing these outside opinions, of which your channel provided several, yours included, and it just made me think like, yeah, no, this is what I believe. I really don't need to, and maybe a lot of listeners can resonate with this, but like the notion that you don't have to get to the bottom of every single claim and argument for something like Christianity or Catholicism to rule it out. Ultimately, at the finality of it, I realized, the creator of the universe probably did not intend for me to learn a layman's amount of textual criticism or, any of these things just for my own salvation. Like, I'm pretty sure that's not how soteriology works. Like, I should not my salvation should not depend on my opinion or belief about something that happened 2000 years ago, right? That is really weird to think that, I think, ultimately. And that applies to Protestants even more than Catholics, because at least Catholics have an element of works that they may profess to more so than Protestants would openly do. I mean, some Protestants agree with that, but theirs is like, imagine your entire salvation based on what you think about this thing that happened a long time ago. And to me, that was just like outrageous. And, I will say, maybe you want to talk about this, but the very idea that coming into contact with Christianity, like as a Pacific Islander or something, could worsen your chances of salvation, is that a preposterous thing? Like, if merely living a moral life according to one's conscience on some island somewhere, and then having the expected animistic, pantheistic, or even for the sake of argument, a flat out monotheistic theistic belief, that's a lot easier of a ticket to heaven than being required to believe the specific tenets of Christianity, much less Catholicism and all its notions of states of grace and mortal sin. Like, I think that's a really big hole in the logic for me, that like it's almost better that you not share the gospel. And that's why I thought to myself, you the only thing that fits the Greek evangelion, right, or good news kind of version of Christianity, is this sort of universalist, like everyone goes to heaven kind of Christianity. That's the only one that I would truly see as good news, and the only one that I think truly would make sense for people wanting to spread throughout the world and let everyone know. Because the whole notion of eternal conscious torment or even annihilationism is not exactly good news. And that's another issue that I took umbrage with, and frankly stopped me from taking the traditional Catholic view that seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I want to come back to that, but just real quick before I forget, my friend Daniel is wondering how much Balthazar you've read.
Okay, I read Dare We Hope, right? And then
That's
Love Alone.
that's not
Love
Belshazzar.
Alone is
That's
credible.
right. That's David Bentley Hart, I think.
No, Dare We Hope is Balthazar, and That All Shall Be Saved is David Bentley Hart.
Oh, you're so right. I'm very dumb. Yeah. Um.
Yeah,
Okay. Cool. Cool.
I've
Cool.
read both. I've read both. I had my dictionary next to me when I read David Bentley Hart's book because he likes to use words that no one else has heard of. Um, and fine. He likes his prose. Fair enough. But yeah, so Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved, right, was the Balthazar work that I was referring to, and then Love Alone is Credible as another from Balthazar, and it's interesting. I was always focused more on these kinds of. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I guess I hear you.
Okay, uh, these aspects of Christianity that were more love focused, if you will. There was that was always really important to me, and I think that's just because I could never shake off the kind of absurdity of eternal hell, and I don't think I ever really believed that ever since I stopped believing it in my younger teenage years, and yeah, it just couldn't really be on my radar, and so the Catholic Church probably appears very legalistic to a lot of people who aren't in it. And, frankly, in my initial exposure to it, reminded me more of the Pharisees than of Christ. um, and I actually looked this up specifically one day, like Catholic Church legalism, and just yeah, one of the things I jotted this down on my computer because I found it so funny. One of the things that I found from a Catholic website, we could say this is basically an apologetics website. Uh, I got this quote. Uh, the church is not too legalistic because all truly valid church laws promulgated by lawful authorities are ultimately in support of God's law. Such laws are ordered for the salvation of souls. And I mean, there are so many presuppositions there. You do have a soul, and there is a God, and he has laws, and we know what those laws exist for the express purpose of the salvation of said souls. We know what God's laws are, and we know how to interpret them with confidence. And the church is the authority and all that. And like, man, there is a lot of cart before that horse. And I just don't think that's a really genuinely truthful way of talking about it. It's just there's so many things you have to believe before you can even approach the Catholic kind of belief. And if you don't believe all of those things, you're just sort of expected to take them along as just a implied, assumed truth. So yeah, that made it really, really difficult for me to go in deeper. And so while I've talked about kind of diving in and trying to look at something from the inside, like at the same time, I guess I'm always kind of keeping it at a healthy arm's length in the sense that I couldn't truly accept certain premises, again, like the eternality of hell, or the uh, maybe some of the arguments for the papacy and things like that. I just sort of took them as working hypotheses while I was reading about Catholicism, but ultimately just didn't do it for me.
Yeah. So you were almost able to like compartmentalize kind of like the hell stuff, I guess, while you were looking into it.
Yes, yeah, and I
Yeah.
think that's honestly really. I mean, maybe that's discussing, but like the I'm sure a lot of us have been there, like it sounds awful to say, but I think for a lot of us, it's like, well, I don't know about it necessarily. Maybe I can hope everyone say it, but at least I'm in, right? It's the kind of is the kind of
Yeah.
way I think a lot of people believe it. And that's true. That's true regardless of whether you're Protestant or Catholic. A lot of people think of themselves as like, well, at least I know I'm saved, especially the once saved, always saved people, right? The kind of Protestant views there. It's like, well, I said the prayer, you know? And that's the church that I grew up in. And so, frankly, yeah. You know, it reminds me of Pascal's wager, which I know you've talked about, right? And I do think that he gets misunderstood a little bit, but you know, believing because we might as well, or because we have no explicit reason not to, is not an argument that in and of itself holds much weight for me, and I think for a lot of people. But you know, one issue is that there having been increasingly reasons not to believe in the picture of God as the Catholic Church frames him. Like Pascal died in 1662. I mean, he died before Darwin's great grandfather was born, let alone Darwin, right? Um, and so I think if you want to talk about like the overall worldview, uh, there was a time when I think it just simply was a little bit easier to believe, and so that's another argument that kind of takes it back to what I was saying about, you know, does God really expect me to play archaeologist and anthropologist and, you know, textual critic and do all of these things just to believe? Like, uh, I don't think so, and I think it was the longer we get away from this kind of historicity of Christ on a timeline, the harder it becomes to believe in the sense that we do have a greater picture of reality that sometimes conflicts with biblical ideas. And it's not just evolution. I mean, like, you know, homosexuality in animals is an argument against, you know, like to some degree, you know, you it just makes, for example, homosexuality in humans seem a lot more regular, and it doesn't seem like this abomination, for example, you know, that the church likes to think of it as.
Yeah. What everything that you were saying there kind of ties in with what my friend Daniel was saying in this comment, where he says that he sees Christianity moving towards a more full understanding of this line from Second Corinthians, but salvation
Yeah.
for all. And I hope I'm like Daniel. If I'm putting words in your mouth, just let me know in the sidebar. But he Daniel is not. He's like the polar opposite of the kinds of Catholics that I grew up with,
Mm,
where Daniel definitely sees a a movement within Christianity, not even necessarily Catholicism, but like one that it very well might be compatible with like naturalism, and it's way
sure.
less. Christianity is going to be way less of a um pharisaical list of laws that you have to obey and things that you must
Yeah,
believe
yeah,
or
yeah.
else, and more of a and maybe this is where I start misrepresenting Daniel, but maybe Christian less of a list of laws and more of a way to live your life, like a philosophy almost.
Right, right.
Um,
I know that can sound like people are just turning Jesus into like, you know, oh, just another moral teacher or something like that. But I don't think you necessarily have to diminish uh, the importance of that by saying, oh, he's just a moral teacher. You could be a full-on Christian believer and still believe that the heart of the message is the heart of Christ, and that, you know, for me, I think if you're going to believe that, you have to believe in universal reconciliation ultimately, you know. But yeah, certainly the moral teachings there that people can kind of take on and channel within themselves is a powerful thing. And I mean, if people convert, often that's the more reasonable reason to convert, not because you were persuaded by arguments that may not even be fully true. You know, I'd rather someone become a Christian because all of the Christians or Catholics around them showed, you know, an undeniable warmth and kindness than because they saw some podcast about the Shroud of Turin, right? Like there's a difference there. Like there's a really palpable difference there. And you know, yeah, I mean, like not to focus on universal reconciliation too much or universalism too much, but that was a lot more of a comfortable belief, it seems, within the Greek speaking world. And when Ionios and some of the Greek got translated into the Latin Vulgate, it does seem like we lost a lot of that flavor And it's at that point, that a lot of medieval theology turns into a Bosch painting. It just becomes a lot freakier and a lot weirder and a lot more terrifying. And you know, I don't think that that's actually in a lot of the text. So I think it can be not some warm, fuzzy thing people believe just because they want to. I think you can get that from exegesis very clearly, and some people have done it. And if you're going to be that kind of Christian, I think that's without a doubt the most respectable kind of Christian out there. And I think that most atheists or agnostics are not really going to shit on your belief very much because it's just so inclusive and so loving ultimately at its core.
Yeah, I mean, I'm even partial to like there are, and I try not to say this too often because I think it just makes a lot of people upset with me. But
Yeah.
there are definitions of the word Christian that I think are, some of them that I think would encompass me. I think that under some definitions of the word, I can say I am a Christian. Um, so I was at the pub with some of my friends last night, playing a nerdy card game, Magic the Gathering. But just for some reason, snakes came up in conversation, and so I said to them that I actually I was just reading Genesis just from the beginning, just for the heck of it, like that morning, and so I was just telling them about it, like how much fun I found the story of the snake, and the snake walks up to Eve, right? And then when God gets angry at the snake, he curses the snake to slither on the ground. That's why snakes don't have legs. And one of my friends commented to me and said, like, you're the most religious, non-religious person that I know. And I said, yeah, all right, I'll take that. I think that's about right.
There's a certain type of person that, and you didn't choose to be this kind of person. Um, you didn't, you can't. I mean, ultimately, I'm very skeptical of free will in a libertarian free will sense. And I actually think that could be interesting to discuss momentarily, because it totally shuts down, a lot of Christian worldviews in the sense that it is about something you do, even if the thing that you do is believe, right? Because we don't get to choose what we believe ultimately. And you don't, if I don't like pepperoni on pizza, I can't just decide to like it. It's literally outside of the realm of possibility. And that goes for so many things, but like you can't help but be. And I think I consider myself in the same group as you. You can't help but be curious about these things and have an interest in these things. And there are people who don't care about the details of Christianity or what happened at this council, or how much of this in the Greek versus the Latin is true. And like they just don't care, and that's totally fine that they care. They couldn't make themselves care if they wanted to. You just don't have that element of control. You are who you are, and you don't really make yourself. And that was ultimately what, to some degree, let my parents accept my agnosticism in my teenage years, was me telling them, like, speaking from within their own worldview, God gave me this brain. God made me this kind of questioning, doubting type, and so this is who I am. I can't force myself to believe it. This is just who He's made me, right? And at least that allowed them to be like, okay, well, I guess I can't argue with God. So there's an element of that you just kind of have to accept. And you can insert other things like some dark forces that are, pulling your son away from Christianity or things like that. But I think ultimately you just have to accept not everyone is going to be as obsessed with this as other people. That's just true.
Yeah, well, your comment there at the end about parents thinking about dark force, that was definitely my experience. Um, but yeah, no, so I totally agree with your point about we don't choose what we believe. And I even think that ever since COVID, there's been a massive migration of people towards the traditionalist movement.
Mm.
I think much of it comes from Novus Ordo Catholics, but there are atheists who are getting pulled into the traditionalist movement too, from atheism, skipping over. Like it's happening, probably not in huge numbers, but like most of these trad converts are probably Novus Ordo trad converts, right? Not atheists to whatever. Why? Why are they going to the trad movement? I think it's because of a sense of belonging. I think. I think that the trad movement is a movement full of um, like countercultural folks, um,
Yep, sure.
folks who like to view themselves as set apart from the general population. Um,
It's the same part of psychology in people's minds that allows them to believe conspiracy theories, right? It's I know the real truth, and it's not something that everyone knows, but I've found it. There's something there in people's minds that people love to kind of dig in and find the truth and feel like, yes, I've got it. Um, and I would suggest that if you think you've got the truth, in any conceptual sense, you more or less don't have it, you know? Uh, but that is huge. You're right. I mean, and maybe it was exacerbated by the kind of isolation that was provided courtesy of COVID and lockdowns and things like that, right? That just people struggle to be alone with themselves. That's my favorite Blaise Pascal quote, right? That all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit
sit,
quietly in a
yeah,
room alone. And that is, I mean, that speaks more to the truth of something like meditation. You know, the if you want to talk about, I mean, for me, I think of my survey of world religions, I spent a good 5, 6 years in studying Vedanta and Vedic philosophy, and then Buddhism in various forms, Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, etc. And one thing that you'll see in a lot of those traditions is such an emphasis on the contemplative kind of way of life. And this exists, you can read Meister Eckhart, for example, and similar things like that. Um, but the whole point is, there's this sort of meme on the internet, right? Of you are in a cult if all the promises made will be fulfilled after your death, right? And that's, like a jokey kind of memey thing, but there's truth to that. And plenty of Christians would argue, well, that doesn't apply to me because I've become a warmer, kinder, more loving person in this very life, thanks to my belief in Christ and what I believe he's done through me. Perfect, right? I would also argue that in the kind of dharmic religions, mostly of the Indian subcontinent and beyond, uh, there is an emphasis on looking at reality right now in your immediate experience, non-conceptually. And that requires you to just drop the concepts, drop the stories, drop the narration, drop the storytelling, and just exist, right? And not many people have spent more than several minutes consciously in their entire lives just being in this moment without any belief, not without believing, oh, I'm a human being sitting in a room, and just without putting any labels on anything. That to me is the closest thing to a religious experience I've ever had, and that can be very powerful, is just seeing bare naked reality, right? And if you're looking for truth, it's like, that's truth, right? That's undeniable. Anything that's conflicting with your immediate perceptual reality, you should discard if it really does conflict with that. But that, it doesn't tell you anything, it's just there. And so I think a lot of people could benefit from something like that. That's it's funny when we mentioned Blaise Pascal, I'll have to throw out a Meister Eckhart quote real quick. This is one of my favorites, but understand this truly, that remaining quite still, leaving memory, reason, and will behind for as long at a time as possible is the best thing you can do. I think that really sums up what you see in Christian mysticism, what you see in traditions around the world. And they, to the degree, I'm not trying to go all perennial philosophy here and argue that they all have some sort of internal core that's the same. But the degree that they all point to reality, direct experience, silence, or stillness, of course they all point to the same thing because this is all the same reality, right? But I think too many people are uncomfortable facing their own immediate existence, that of course we're going to reach for screen, we're going to reach for something, right? We're going to go to Reddit, we're going to go to a video game, we're going to do anything other than sit quietly in that room alone, as Blaise Pascal said. And so that to me is like the crux of the issue is, are people really willing to do that, or do they want to crawl into whatever belief is the most comfortable? And I don't mean to make that sound particularly, it came across more scathing than it needs to, because I understand the impulse to want to snuggle up in bed with a nice belief, and it's something we know, right? Whereas bare reality is always kind of the unknown. But I do think that that's the more likely place you're going to find truth is your immediate experience. Yeah.
You know what you were reminding me of when you were talking about kind of like the meditative, like being alone in a room type thing too. I think to some degree of the extent of the success of the rosary, I think, is uh, tied up in that as well. I think because for a long time the rosary was the closest thing that I ever got to meditation. Um, and
Yeah.
don't get
Yeah.
me wrong. So I prayed the rosary every day, um, for most of my life. And I didn't do meditation because I viewed meditation as like secular meditation.
And no,
'Cause-
no. Yeah.
yeah, I viewed that as like pagan and stuff. But I did start doing secular
Yeah.
meditation after, and
Mm,
I'll do
yeah.
those guided ones because I'm not very good at meditating. But I'll put on like a 15-minute YouTube video and I'll do a 15-minute guided meditation. Um, and the experience is similar, not the same, but similar. At least it
Sure.
was
I
for
mean,
me.
yeah, the rosary, I mean, take something, the easiest parallel, I can find two parallels that would be the closest to something like the rosary, right? One would be Pure Land Buddhism, or Jingtu Zong in Chinese, of, um, it's a particularly uh, Christianized, let's say, offshoot of Buddhism. It's not coming from Christianity or anything, but they're similar in the sense that there's just a belief in Amitabha, who is this uh, Buddha of infinite light, and you don't have to do anything in your own life. You just have to trust that after you die, you'll be born in this kind of heaven-like realm where you can become fully enlightened, right? And they chant on beads. They chant over and over again Namo Amitabha, or Amitofo in Chinese. They would just chant these things over and over again. Or Gaudiya Vaishnavism, right, which is more commonly known in the West as the Hare Krishna movement. I know you
Ah,
interviewed a guy who ascribes to this, and so he's going to be chanting that over and over again on his beads, right, 108 times, because the number 108 is so significant in Dharmic religion. But it's when you do anything like any of those, where the repetition of a mantra is so continuous, or the repetition of the words is so continuous, do you really have any room for your regular judging conceptual mind to jump in? Or no, you're saying the same syllables, and you're going through the pattern. So there is a kind of mental silence, or a silencing of a part of your mind, that occurs when you do that, right? And so that can develop some pretty interesting states, and for the people who are convinced of the particular um, divinity of something like the rosary, you can try it with different words, right? You can try saying Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola, and see how it goes. I guarantee you'll get into some interesting state. It's difficult for people to do that because they know that they're saying something that's nonsense. But if you believe it, it's a different story. And we know that this culminates in religious experience for people across traditions. So you either agree that all the people who are not Catholic, who are chanting on beads, are somehow being possessed by demons or something, and yours is right, or they're all providing a similar phenomenon within our understanding of neuroscience. And I think that's a lot more likely. Just like we see crying statues in India and crying statues of Mary, you either agree that they're both miracles, both not, or that some are the instigation of demons, let's say, and some are legitimately from God. And I think we can see which of those three is the most rational to believe.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, just going back to the rosary real quick, because you said
Yes.
you could say Coca Cola, and it's kind of the same effect. Um, I did find that, like, because I was taught the rosary from such a young age, like, so I went into first grade having already had the Hail Mary memorized. Um,
Yeah.
so I never really thought about the words of the Hail. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, I was so young.
The meaning wasn't. Yeah.
I was too young to even know what I was saying, but I was saying something. And so the rosary for me absolutely was a chant in the sense that it
It was an
wasn't.
incantation,
Yeah, well,
right?
Yeah, it was something for me to say to put me into a state of mind to let my
Yeah, yeah,
mind
yeah,
do
yeah.
other stuff. It wasn't for me to
Sure.
sit there and think about what I'm saying. In fact, it was the
It
opposite. Like,
wasn't a mindful kind of contemplation of the meaning of the words, right?
right.
Totally.
Yeah.
And people who are chanting, for example, we'll take the Vaishnava concept of chanting Hare Krishna or Om Namo Narayana or something. Any people who do that, particularly, again, I'll use the Hare Krishnas as a specific example because within their organization, they're required to chant this a pretty excessive number of times per day. And if you want to actually complete it, you are just going machine gunning your way through this thing because it's the only way you're going to get it done, and still have time to cook dinner, right? Uh, that is interesting to me because they'll also talk about the benefits of something like chanting mindfully and really taking your time on each beat to say it and feel the love of God. And it's like, well, yeah, you can do that. You just also have to say goodbye to, your requirement of chanting it this number of times per day, right? And the very idea that, this Palestinian woman who also happens to be the mother of God and is really really important in the Catholic kind of pantheon. I hate to use that word because I know we're not talking about a divinity here, but let's be honest, she's been given some special powers post mortem. The very idea that she would say to certain humans, yeah, 4 times actually for the rosary would be best. I like that. Oh, and my Salve Regina, I like that Latin chant. That's my favorite. And but the idea of that, doing it a certain number of times, yeah, it almost eliminates the possibility that you could chant it particularly mindfully because you've been told that more is better, and that means a lot of people, yeah, they are just going to buzz right through the words. But I can resonate with your understanding of like maybe not thinking about it consciously when you were really little, if you learned it that young. I mean, when I was little, I thought elemento was a letter, like a singular letter,
Yeah.
like the coolest letter in the alphabet, elemento. And you know sometimes it's only later on in our life. I'm not suggesting I was, in my 20s when I figured out the alphabet. No, like sometimes it's only after we've looked back on a particular memory or a thing that we really try to fully digest it and understand it. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. There's probably a lot of Catholic children out there who are saying the Hail Mary is nothing other than a particular string of vowels and consonants. And that's going to give people a special feeling in the same way it's going to give people around the world who are doing some sort of mantra meditation special feelings. And is that going to give these Catholic children the feeling that they are like, in touch with God? Yeah, maybe. I think I'm paraphrasing Sam Harris here, but he said something like, if you think that God helped you find your keys this morning, but he's also allowing childhood leukemia, there's a problem. There is a problem with that, and it's really easy to forget about things like that and just look at the a kind of pareidolia of symbolism, where you see the church on that, you see the cross on that church across the street, and you think that's a sign from God just for you, right? We tend to do that with all sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that the point that you just made, kind of what pareidolia, seeing signs everywhere.
Yeah, it's usually described as seeing faces, right, in a very physical
Okay.
sense. But I think in a larger, you look at like the outlet on your wall and it looks like a little surprised face, or whatever it may be. I think in terms of a larger degree of just seeing symbols or patterns, and ascribing them to having meaning towards your life in a very main character syndrome sort of way. Yeah.
What what I was gonna say was that I think that kind of ties into the title of this video, but the tractor beam. I think that, and I'll say this as somebody who still lives in the global West, but I think that it's easy for somebody to kind of get sucked into this, like, kind of their algorithm gets all funky, and all of a sudden they're getting all these trad YouTube videos, and then they start seeing signs everywhere. Particularly, I think in the West, where it's there legitimately is Christian imagery everywhere.
Yeah.
But I think that's kind of part of the tractor beam in a sense. You know what I mean? Like I think that like, I don't know. I watch videos on YouTube of recent converts to the traditionalist movement in particular, and they'll talk about how um, they were thinking about whether or not they should convert, and um, then their spouse got them roses, and they were like, "Oh, roses remind me of Our Lady. This is a sign from Our Lady," or you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm kind of
Or
sitting
even
here like,
something more explicit, like, oh, I was walking down the street and some woman gave me a miraculous medal, right?
mm,
Like, before when I was, in my early 20s, not Christian at all, I remember being given chick tracts by people, right? And, I imagine if I was on the fence at that particular day, I would have viewed that as like a sign from God, despite chick tracts being like absolutely ridiculous. But still,
yeah,
you know, you would you would necessarily almost be looking for those things when you go out of the house. Do you know what I mean? If you're an alcoholic, you notice the stores, you notice the liquor stores almost at an unconscious level, right? And people who have coffee, drinkers are going to notice all of the cafes. It's like when someone becomes pregnant and they start noticing pregnant women everywhere. It's like that's not some sort of magical thing. You just didn't notice them all before, right? We have to acknowledge that that is an established fact of perception, that we tend to turn into this grandiose, meaningful thing when it's religious in nature.
so, funny like side tangent here. Maybe a week or so ago, um, my wife and I were talking about the car that my mom used to drive when I was a kid. It was a Toyota Sienna, the SUV, like the minivan. Um, and I said something like, "Man, they don't make Toyota Siennas anymore, right? I haven't seen one in years." And my wife goes, "No, they're still making Toyota Siennas." And I said, "Really?" And we were in the car, and over the next like 15 minutes, we saw like 8 Toyota Siennas.
Yep, yep,
Um,
yep, yep. Totally.
but I think the Sienna is a car that like it's a minivan. You're not really gonna like notice it unless you're looking for it. And I never was looking for it, so I never saw them. And then I started thinking about the Sienna, and then I saw like 8 of them in like 10 minutes. So,
Yeah,
and I
totally.
think that the same thing happens too with people who get sucked into the YouTube rabbit hole of kind of Catholic content, and then they start seeing Catholic stuff everywhere. You know what I mean? I think that's kind of like
Totally.
part of the the tractor beam. I think that pulls people in. I
Yeah.
think.
We can't help to some degree with our minds look for meaning everywhere, and so Christians probably have an aversion to seeing a Reddit comment with 666 likes.
Yeah.
There's little things like that that we just can't help but do, right? When I spent time in China, I realized a lot of buildings don't have a fourth floor on the elevator. It goes
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 5, right?
Hmm.
And so, for anyone who doesn't know, four and the word for death in Chinese, 四, are synonymous. So, I mean, you'd think everyone on the fifth floor knows they're actually on the fourth floor, right? But uh, it's like we can do some kind of, we can expect to some degree that kind of thing across cultures. They're all going to have their own sort of superstitions and things like that. And I know people hate to use the word superstition when they're talking about their own religious belief because it just seems deeply offensive and whatnot. But there is superstitious thinking at the heart of a lot of the ways we go throughout our day, just trying to find meaning or make sense of the world. It's very difficult to shake off. It's only if you're doing it very consciously. And again, I would argue that this is the main argument for something like meditation. And I would argue that anyone who wants to have a practice of meditation should take on something that is ultimately non-conceptual. So I would say breath meditation makes a lot more sense. You're not adding any words to the practice. You're just sticking with what's literally there in your already present moment experiencing. And for anyone who's Catholic or Christian listening, I was once told when I was talking to a Buddhist monk, he said this as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, and it is. He said, the Buddhists don't own the breath. Like, you're allowed to pay attention to your breathing too. Like, it's not inherently demonic. And yeah, I would say doing something that allows you to gain a greater sense of conscious awareness in any given moment, it's going to allow you, regardless of religious belief, to notice more often when your mind is leading you down a rather faulty line of logic. Yeah. And that's really, really important, especially in today's world.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Despite the fact though that the Buddhists don't own breath, I remember very much so growing up being taught that like anything Buddhist related was satanic. Um, and
Sure.
that's the kind of
Oh yeah,
Catholic
I
I grew
get
up
it.
as.
Yeah, yeah, and there's these people online who have these beliefs that yoga is incompatible and
That's right. Yeah.
nice. I'm glad you still have the 666th hymn to that guy. Um, yeah, I mean, it's weird. It really is because what goes as yoga in the West is just asana. It's just posture. And I mean, if you go back to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, or the early kind of part of yoga, the whole point of these asanas was to maintain some degree of health within the body and to prepare you for sitting meditation. So the whole point was ultimately meditation. And for a Catholic who doesn't care about the meditation part at all, to just you know yeah, hang out in downward dog for 5 minutes. I don't think Satan's coming after you. I think you're fine, really. But at the same time, if it scares you, that should say something about your own mind more than anything. I would say even to ex-Catholics, does the idea of do you feel uncomfortable standing in front of a statue of the Buddha at like an art museum or something? I mean, maybe yes, maybe no. Why is that? Is there still something that you haven't totally shaken off? I would encourage people to explore that a little bit.
Yeah. And Zach asks if it's possible to consider meditation as valuable without smuggling in a narrative. And Edward, I think that was kind of your whole point. Like, I think your whole point was the Buddhists don't own your breath. like,
Well, I
it
would
is.
say it just in a greater, yeah. I mean, well, just take it in the most non-religious way possible. If anyone listening can just be quiet for the next 10 seconds and just notice what's already there, I mean, there's a lot of, you can look at the sort of some of the higher esoteric, pointers that you get in some of these traditions that talk about enlightenment and things. And one of them is to simply just notice your experience right now. See to the degree that you're actually not doing anything. The breath breathes itself, you are being lived. And just notice that and see that that happens completely on its own without any permission from a so-called you know now, I mean, if you just look at your experience in any given moment and be completely quiet, you're not really adding anything to that experience. You have your own history or whatever, and you can't shake all of that off. But in terms of smuggling in a narrative, I would say the closest thing you can get to in your life of being free of a narrative is just existing quietly in any given moment. I mean, that's the closest you're going to get to reality. So if you can't, be there with no narrative, you have no hope at all anyway. So you might as well try to approach it from the purest place possible.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a question. When we were talking, this is going back a little bit, but we were talking briefly about superstitions. Um, and you said something to the effect of like, I think maybe it's rude to refer to some of these things as superstitions. But I'm not sure if you saw the video that I did on the scapular, but I referred to it as a superstition. Perhaps it's a little rude, but um, and I know at the beginning of our conversation you were talking about how you would like try religious practices, maybe not to the point of straight up affirming the proposition, but like you would try to live the religion. Did you ever try wearing a scapular or anything like that? Or if not, did you ever try doing any of the superstitious things in any of the other religions that you did try?
I would say the closest thing that I had thought to do was crossing myself before getting in a vehicle or something,
Okay.
which I view as a good example of a more ubiquitous superstition within Christianity. I mean, it's viewed as a kind of like God protect me sort of thing. But if you're doing it in a very like, oh, just in case, might as well throw one of these up, that to me speaks to that kind of superstition. Or the people who believe in the miraculous medal, who they're buying these things in bulk. They're handing them out everywhere. People who believe in this, I've seen, YouTube comments on videos like this for, I do roofing and I always slip a miraculous medal under the roof tiles. It's things like that are, if you view that as anything other than superstition, what the hell is it? I mean, in Thailand, Thai Buddhist amulets are like everywhere. And I mean, the funny thing is, it's like that's completely in contradiction to like the earlier teachings of the Buddha. This kind of idea that you would just like, you know, settle for some sort of superstitious little amulet or something. But it's huge. It's almost a natural outgrowth of religious belief to have something like that at some point. You know,
I think
so
it's
I'm not
human nature.
surprised that it exists. Yeah, I think that's just incredibly common, and I can also see why there's like a Catholic aversion to it, in the same way that there would be like a Sunni Muslim aversion to it, right? That would be the even more extreme one, right? Like we can't even paint a freaking picture of people because it's akin to, yeah. Um, they would obviously say idolatry rather than superstition, but of course the allowing of depicting of people or images, I would say, can ultimately culminate in something more superstitious, like a miraculous medal or a Thai amulet. And yeah, I don't, I couldn't do that and believe what I was doing, you know. And
Yeah.
maybe there's been an atheist out there who's like a really sure of themselves and their belief. Maybe they can, throw on a miraculous medal and go throughout their day. And but I would say the danger of doing that is that, like, if anything good happens to you, even though it may have happened anyway, you may be tempted to blame it on the medal. And that's one of those things. That's one of the kind of early points that someone would make about something like prayer, is that, if you're praying to a milk jug and sometimes your prayers are answered and sometimes they aren't, it doesn't say anything about the milk jug, right? It says something about chance and probability and a number of other things that really don't sound quite as sexy as my prayer was answered. But the same sort of processing of information and meaning within our brains happens when we do something like wear a scapular or a medal. So yeah, I would say that's how I see it. Yeah.
And for the record, we absolutely, when I say we, like my community, we absolutely did um uh give credence to the idea that like these sacramentals, the scapular, the miraculous medal, these things were causing good things to happen in our lives. Generally, they were like good religious things, but we would all hear like old wives' tales about like, there was this woman and her husband had stopped practicing because he was drinking a lot. And so he stopped going to confession and he stopped going to mass. And so she was going to mass alone every Sunday. And one day the priest was like, here, take this miraculous medal and put it under his pillow. And that very
Mm,
Sunday, he woke up and he was like, you know what? I think I'm going to go to church today. I'm going to stop drinking. And then, wow, the miraculous medal cured my husband of his alcoholism. But like, it's kind of
yeah, it's
funny,
just
but we would hear
yeah.
these
I mean, it's
stories.
some because you must then ask the question, well, why not two miraculous medals? Is two better than one? And the question is, if it's not, and someone was like, well, that's silly. The whole point is that you're showing your faith in Mary or whatever. But it's like, does Mary not know I already had faith in her before I spent, $6.99 on this miraculous medal? And, if she didn't, that's weird. And if she did, why the medal? Um, especially something like a scapular, which is supposed to be worn under the clothes, right? Generally, it's not like something you flaunt and show off to people or whatever. So, the only one who would know would be you and the supposed other. And that makes me think, well, yeah, why need it exist at all? And I actually think that's a very agnostic kind of atheist response, but it's also a very Protestant one, being like, why the hell do you think you guys need all this? Like, God already knows you believe. And I must say that is a lot more simple of a way of looking at it. And yeah, the church does warn against the superstition, but we have to look at how is it actually happening in the real world.
So the church does this funny thing where it does warn against superstition in its official content, like context. And then it does a very little to clamp down on the superstition. Why? I think this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. I think that people within the church are very nervous about, kind of poo-pooing on people's pious devotions. And so, okay,
Right.
somebody's a little bit too piously devoted to the miraculous medal. I'm going to look the other way. Even though, like, they're definitely treating this thing like it's a superstition. But hey, if it's bringing them closer to
Sure.
God, then I'm just going to kind of like, avert my eyes and pretend like I didn't see that. I think that
Right. You
happens
don't
a
have
lot.
to, yeah, like you don't have to believe in the tilma. You don't have to necessarily believe in all of these extraordinary claims. But if you do, we're not going to say you're wrong. right? And that goes for so much, is that there's room for this, or some of these we cannot confirm, that this private revelation was necessarily genuine, but if you're interested in that book, here's the link. And I think there's something a little contradictory there. It looks like a conflict of interest to me at best.
And I mean, we
Or
would
at
do
worst.
things like, so we would do things like, you don't have to believe Fatima, but we are going to name our church after Fatima. There's going to be a sermon at least once a month talking about Fatima. We're going to say the Fatima prayer
Yeah.
at the end of Mass, but it's optional. Is it really? So,
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
it's a
that,
question of being ostracized from a community. Like, if you want to be a part of this community anyway,
right.
And yeah, it's a critique of the people more than the church, but the church is people,
That's exactly what I was going to say.
and yeah.
There is no, if there were no Catholics, there would be no Catholic church. The church, and this is true of any organization, right? Like, organizations aren't platonic ideals that exist, with or without people. And so, like, you're right. And maybe what Thinker is saying here too is that, like, this is a critique of the way that it's a critique of the practice, not a critique of the rule. And, like, that's fair. Like, because the church does have official ways that it says don't be superstitious. Then I just think it doesn't enforce that at all. So,
Yeah. And I don't mean to come across like, I get as annoyed as I think any believer does when you see, you go on a place that's particularly anti-religion like Reddit, and you see the comments section on some of these things, and that annoys me as much as it annoys any believer, I think, when people just say, oh yeah, more priests diddling kids and this and that. And it's like the most, they're the most kind of uneducated arguments, for or against religion there. I just, that's a really unfortunate thing. It's unfortunate for everyone because, if you're going to dismiss a religion, do it for the best reasons. Don't do it for the worst ones. And all that does is make other people, probably rightly, think that you don't know a thing about Catholicism, right? And I think we see that a lot. And actually, those people who are making those comments are the same kind of people who in 5 years could be a Catholic, because they're at some point going to realize, oh shit, I didn't really know what this was about, And that's precisely how that works. It's like you don't know until you do. And if you go deep enough into all of the information, I would argue you're probably going to come back out the other side again. But I think a lot of people stay. And, for anyone who's happy in the Catholic Church, all the best to you. I'm thrilled, honestly. I personally couldn't, for the reasons I've said, I think sufficiently. But I can understand why people feel comfortable there or feel convinced of certain things, certainly.
yeah. And I will say too that I am far less concerned with where somebody actually winds up on pretty much any of the things that I talk about on the channel, and I'm way more concerned with like the methods that you use to get there, and then just making sure that we have access to the same information. Like, if
Yeah.
somebody, like, if me and somebody else look at the exact same information and we both think critically about it and then we disagree, I kind of don't care. Like, whether we fall
Totally.
on one side
But I
or
think
the
that
other.
happens very rarely. Yeah. So that's the issue, right? Like the information thing. I mean, why does the tractor beam exist? What is the tractor beam? The tractor beam is Catholic Answers and Plants with Aquinas, and only listening to
Yes.
people who, that's what it is. And it is that no matter what area, of belief you happen to be in. You can go on Eastern Orthodox YouTube and just find people talking about how the papacy is clearly a scam and why this is the absolute truth. And I found the Eastern Orthodox part of YouTube really weird because, like, what it comes across in this really like red pill, like masculine flavor of, it's kind of odd. And I don't think it actually exists that way in reality. But YouTube and reality can sometimes be very different things. But there's any of these individual, I hate to use the word echo chamber because, again, it sounds so negative, but that's basically ultimately what it is. We're talking about encapsulating, only these opinions in this space, and just kind of only listening to people who agree with, that's just how it goes with a lot of these things. And so when I hear you say, I want people to have all the information, I think what that necessarily entails is people doing something that is very difficult to do, and we know this about human psychology, right? Look at politics, right? How many people who are huge supporters of Donald Trump are listening to like the legitimate, real, like the legitimate criticisms, not like the shit we see thrown all the time? And how many people who are, head over heels for Joe Biden, all three of them, um, could hear the legitimate critiques that came from conservatives. I mean, I just think that sometimes it's useful. I will say, I didn't want to talk about politics because I'm not particularly political myself. Um, Sometimes it's useful to look at it as a kind of analogy for religion, in the sense that people can be very strong in their convictions, very uninterested in listening to people who disagree with them. And we know that those are kind of cures, let's say, for a lot of what's problem in politics. So why would it not also be true of religion? Just listen to a variety of opinions. And I think at that point, you have my blessing, regardless of what you decide on. Just don't put yourself in an echo chamber by your own design. Like, C.S. Lewis said, hell is locked from the inside. Well, your echo chamber is also locked from the inside, and you can
That's a really
go
good point.
anytime you want.
Yeah, no, that is a really good point. And something that and this may come across wrong. I like Barbarian's joke here. I like apologetics for one thing, and when philosophers and biblical scholars critique them, I learn a lot. But something that I've found out that I kind of accomplished by accident was that my channel is being recommended primarily to people who are in the Catholic echo chamber, right? People whose algorithm is like, oh, only give them Catholic content. They get my stuff. I'm not quite sure how to help you with that. Sorry, that was my Alexa chiming in for no reason. But it's funny because I get a lot of people commenting under my videos being like, who is this guy and why is he in my algorithm? And I'm like, I don't know, dude.
Yeah.
Because I'm talking about that stuff, I guess. YouTube can't tell that I'm not Catholic, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, some people do that even intentionally, and I think to the degree that they're trying to combat the echo chamber, it makes sense. Like Paulogia and some of these things where the thumbnail or the title kind of suggests that, like, the religious believer destroys the atheist or whatever. I mean, I know that's a clickbait as old as YouTube, but to the degree that it is getting people to maybe view something that they ought to view but wouldn't have otherwise clicked on, I think it's useful. And at the end of the day, I think hopefully everyone can agree that it is important to have like legitimate dialogue or expose yourself to a variety of opinions. And anyone who disagrees with that, I ultimately ask why. Like, what is the harm? Because at the end of the day, if it's true, it's still true. And if it's not, you should be happy that, you weren't pulled into the tractor beam.
I love that. Yeah, ultimately, I think that we're all on the same team. Like, we're all humans on this weird planet stumbling around trying to find our way towards truth. And that's why I find the whole kind of partisan nature it's like politics, like you said, the kind of partisan nature of religion, I just find to be like strange. And it seems like don't we all want to be on the same team? I
Right.
do.
No, I completely agree.
Yeah. Well, hey, Edward, I don't know about you. I think that's a great note to end on. The idea that, we all really should be on the same team, even if it doesn't always seem like we are. But before we do wrap up, I was just wondering, is there anything else that you kind of wanted to throw in there? Any last topics you wanted to hit on?
No, honestly, I mean, I think that is a good note to end on, and I won't sully it by flapping my jaws anymore. If you ever want to chat again sometime, let me know. I'd be happy to do a part two. I think there's a few things we didn't necessarily touch on to the degree that I would if I wasn't going to work soon. But I think, maybe that's something you're interested in or whatever. But
I would love
I
that.
had a great time talking to you. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. And I think you're a unique audience you're a unique guest for my audience, too. I think that you have a perspective that not a whole lot of people have. So I would absolutely love to do a part two. I think that'd be awesome.
Cool. Well,
All
thanks for
right.
your time.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for coming on. It has been an absolute blast. I look forward to the next time, but until then, Adios.
Take care.